welcome to another week of ProMAX Tech Talks. I'm Matt in the living room laboratory, and as always, I'm joined by my tech team. Today, we'll be talking about how to access your NAS storage remotely. But before we get started, don't forget to hit that red subscribe button below to see the latest content from ProMAX Systems as it comes out. So guys, NAS devices were designed for local storage. Now we've seen that people are going to have to access some of their stuff remotely. What are some scenarios where people are going to do that? Nathaniel, you want to lead us off?
We're all working in a new normal here, right? We're all working from home, except with Taylor, although Taylor, that might be your home, the warehouse there.
Working home away from home.
Exactly. But if you have large files, or if you have any sort of file infrastructure at your office, that's probably on a NAS. And for our customers, when you're working with video assets, these big giant video files, those are generally stored on some kind of centralized local storage like a NAS. And when you need to access those is anytime you need to work. So it's for our customers, you're constantly accessing a NAS.
Great. Thanks, Nathaniel. So Taylor, do you want to talk a little bit about the difference between accessing a NAS when you're local versus remotely? Let's start with like the connection process and what that looks like.
Yeah, so when you're local at your office, your IT team or yourself or whoever manages that area has set up, most likely a high performance network for your local office. Like connecting to your NAS will be a pretty simple process and it'll be very fast. When you need to connect remotely, you're talking about adding a lot more complexity because now you're accessing that NAS through the internet, which means that there's going to be more security concerns. There's going to be a lot more latency. There's going to be, you may have great internet at your house. You may have great internet at your office. But if your connection between those two sites, someone has a really bad connection, you can, experience some pretty poor performance. There's a couple ways to go about doing a connection remotely. Your first is going to be a VPN, which is basically where you connect your workstation to your network at your office through a private tunnel. That adds a lot more security, but it also adds a lot more, latency. Your performance goes down significantly, so you won't see your actual network performance for your internet over that VPN. There's also a couple ways, services like TeamViewer, AnyDesk, Teradici for like video over IP, which allow you to remote into workstations or other computers at your office. Each one of those comes with their own flavor of how you're going to interact with your NLE, with your NAS storage, how you're going to mount things, and what performance you're going to see is going to depend, on your connection, which service you're using, and what your office's connection is like as well.
Thanks, Taylor. So Brian, Taylor just touched on some of the things that are challenges to accessing a NAS remotely, specifically bandwidth. Do you want to touch on some more, what other factors can impact your performance in a remote connection?
Yeah, I mean, so just to expand on something Taylor said, if you do connect via VPN, that's still just a connection into the network in your office. You still have to actually mount and connect to the storage, and that's usually using a different protocol like SMB. The vast majority of the NASs out there are connected via SMB in most situations. That said, SMB doesn't like latency. Like it's designed for a local network. So when you start running that across 2,000 miles, the performance drops even harder. So it just stacks on. Like a lot of this stuff is kind of it's not jury rigged, but it's not designed for this kind of operation. It's designed for local network use. So there's things like that. The other factor here, and Taylor touched on this a little bit too. You've got the latency side of it, like just the feel of how things work. So even if you can get data, there's some unknowns about how the program that you're using reacts when it takes a lot longer than normal for what it thinks is a local file to be processed. Like you can start running into strange timeouts. You can start running into, renders that fail or do strange things. Because the program, again, this goes back to the VPN side. The VPN not fakes, but allows it to present as a kind of locally attached storage. The program doesn't know any better. It just knows that things aren't responding like they normally do. And that can cause all sorts of other strange things. Yeah, those are some of the big ones. The other factors, when you get on like the PC over IP kind of solutions, that's a lot IT. It's a lot more of an IT heavy situation or a solution to deploy, to maintain. It's usually a one-to-one type situation where you've got one workstation connecting to one, whereas you're not really sharing resources across an entire network so much as it's just a dial-in point-to-point type setup. Super useful if you have a scenario where it makes sense, but it's not kind of the all-encompassing connection into the internet world that we're all kind of looking for, right?
And I would say it's interesting, as I talk to customers, you can kind of always tell how much they've messed around with trying to connect remotely to a NAS in the past, based on like their expectation in the conversation. Whereas like the people that haven't done this, they almost act like I'm trying to hide information from them. Like, well, sure, but how can this work exactly the same as in the studio? And I'm like, well, this is the best option for that. This is as close as you're going to get. And they're like, sure, but what else? And the people that have done this always come in like bruised and battered, and they're like, now I know this is gonna suck, but how can we make remote accessing this a little bit better? And those are always the people that I know. I'm like, oh, you've done this a couple times before. And look, there are ways around this stuff. There are ways to make this smoother, better. But Brian, it's exactly what you were saying. Like, it's just very different when you're working with giant files that require giant performance on applications like Adobe Premiere, After Effects, Resolve, that are designed and tested and expecting local files. You start putting that, connecting all that over a VPN, and stuff goes sideways real quick.
So is there any impact on the type of workstation you're using and the performance you get? Can that vary between, like, say, a Mac and a PC, or just like the generation of workstation you're on?
So this is the hardest thing about the remote connecting. There are so many variables that even if you have the most primo workstation possible, your connection to the internet might still be worse than me and my Chromebook. When it comes to downloading the files that I want, or getting the files that I want. It sounds insane, but it is absolutely true. Like, there are just times, and literally there are just times when your internet is worse than others. Like, we've all experienced this, especially, a month ago when everybody cut over all at the same time. It was like, whoa, we use, Microsoft Teams and Zoom, and all of those services just slowed to a crawl. And a lot of times not even for their own reasons, like just for general internet bandwidth situations. So it's extraordinarily hard. That said, if you're going to stack the deck in your favor, big workstation, lots of RAM, big video card, it never hurts. In an ideal situation, our solution in particular, one of the things that we zeroed in on first is you got to have the performance. So we actually, like, our go-to is having the local cache drive that kind of syncs as the secondary operation. So you're not reliant on the direct sync to the office. You're working on local copies of your stuff. So in that situation, having a high-end workstation is absolutely going to benefit you, because you're working with the copy that's there in your home. And then as you make changes, it's syncing to the outside world and everything kind of at its own pace at that point. So you're not kind of at the mercy of the waxing and waning of the internet connections and latency.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, Brian, is we were doing a lot of testing. Brian and I both have gigabit up and down, like gigabit fiber internet at our homes. So we were passing files back and forth, and I think we saw up to about 250 megabits sustained, like legitimately passing files back and forth, which was still pretty cool. That's still a fourth of what we've both seen from our setups.
Yeah.
And it was fun. It actually felt a lot like the old original, like, fiber channel days in like 2001, 2002 of like, oh, let's try this drive, where it's all like so exploratory, which is kind of fun and nostalgic almost. But the crazy thing with so much of this is so many of the factors are not even something you can troubleshoot, right? It's just factors that affect your performance between your home and another user or a studio or an office, and what you can do to change those. A lot of those factors you can't touch, change, troubleshoot. It's just, there's a lot of unknowns between your connection and theirs that you will never be able to touch.
Yeah, and frankly, that's, I mean, that was always the draw of doing having a local studio. Like, all of that is within your control at that point. It's much more predictable, instead of a crazy 50% variance on your speeds, or more in some cases. You're talking like, a couple percent, maybe,
Well, and not to, pitch our solution, but this is, like you were saying, we do this approach of having the local cache drive. But where that's so important is like that creates a local environment that you're working with, so those things aren't a factor. I was talking to somebody yesterday about proxy workflows, which is another kind of popular one right now, because it looks good on paper. You look at a proxy workflow and you're like, oh, these are big files, so it's slow to bring them across the internet. Well, let's just make the big file smaller. And to a certain degree, that is absolutely accurate. But then as we kind of talk through the workflow, it's not obvious, and it's not things that people think about often, in that he didn't really realize that when you go to conform, when you go to render out that high-res media, you've got proxies and a project file on a local workstation connected over a VPN. And I said, you're going to either have to push that project file back to the office through something like a Teradici, which then you're mixing these things, which doesn't make any sense. I said, or you could render it out if you're connected to a VPN, but that VPN connection now is going to have to reference all of that high-res media. That render, depending on what it is, that could turn that into a 12-hour render, because you need to reference those high-res files locally.
And God forbid your VPN times out in the middle of that.
Oh my God.
I found that one out the hard way a couple weeks ago. It's not fun. So guys, to wrap up this episode, Brian, you touched on it a little bit. You said, and Nathaniel, you said you weren't going to plug our solution, but it's time. Do you guys want to dive in a little bit about our solution to remote access? Nathaniel, you want to kick us off?
I already did my part, right? But
Brian, you want to take it?
Yeah. Brian, why don't you take that? Because I think I did some of that.
Yeah, I mean, so just from an overview perspective, our approach to this is, again, our big factors in this are performance, collaboration, and an organization, right? Like, those are the things you need to have an actual functional workflow for a work group, not just one user. Like, if you're just a single user, the world is your oyster. Like, there's a million ways to do this stuff. But if you have to collaborate with other people, you have to have those factors in play. So the way that we have things set up, we deploy a small Media Hub server at your location, so in your home, in your secondary office, wherever, and then that basically does a real-time sync, an always-on real-time sync with your main unit or your other coworkers. So if you've got 5 other coworkers, they all have these devices. Everybody's syncing together. Everybody's working from a little 8 terabyte drive that's part of those servers. So you've got several projects that are ongoing. And as you work, you're working from your local system, from that local server, just like, kind of the local server that was in your building to begin with. When you make a change, that change is propagated to your whole work group. So if your After Effects person throws a graphic in, or your sound person adds a voiceover, you can just grab that right off your local drive, because as you're working, that data is not waiting for you to request it. It's transferring as soon as they drop it on the network. And what we really went for here is a couple of things. Primarily, again, we wanted performance to be key, and having the local drive allows us to do that without any variability in the network connection or anything like that. And the other thing is we absolutely wanted this to be as easy as possible. So when you open up that project file, if someone else is dropping data in there at their house, it's showing up. You're not, you don't have to deal with proxies if you don't want to. You can deal with full res media if you have the bandwidth to support it. For backup and all that, if you're syncing back to your platform at your facility and there's a backup plan that's running on that, it's getting everybody's changes every day, just like it always did. So there's a lot of benefits to doing it this way. Is it the most, bandwidth minimal way to do it? No, it's not, but it's by far the easiest way to do it, and the least, it requires the least change to your existing workflow. And really, that's the important part. You want to be able to go home, work, go back to the office, work, basically do it exactly the same way. And that's what we were shooting for.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. So thanks everyone for joining us for this week's Tech Talk. Stay tuned next week for our latest episode, and don't forget to hit that red subscribe button and follow us on social media. If you'd like to learn more about our remote workflow solution, head on over to promax.com/remote editing workflows, or feel free to reach out and ask us a question. And if there's anything you want to see in a future episode, leave a comment and we'll make sure that we cover it. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great week.
You guys.